today we are actually talking about the Great Awakening. I mean, we're actually at the Great Awakening. I know that was one of the things that I kind of build this whole session on, these sessions. But we're actually here. And if you remember last week, I kind of plowed through and I didn't give you time to ask questions and stuff like that. I'm going to do something similar this week, but it's going to work like this. I'm going to plow through, but there will be time for you to ask questions at the end. Okay? Is that fair? And then whatever questions you have, and so if you think of something that you really, what was that? Jot it down. Jot it down. And then we'll come back and we'll talk about it afterwards. Okay? The first thing I want you to just get an overview of what the Great Awakening was. It was a revival that swept through the American colonies, roughly 1730 to 1760 through the 1760s. It brought thousands of new souls into the kingdom of God. Okay, tens of thousands. It also altered the religious, social, political landscape of colonial America. It changed who we were as a people. We're going to get into that a little bit later, not necessarily today, but it's amazing. It's amazing what a shift there was in our nation as a result of the Great Awakening. The first thing I want you to know is that it was part of a global awakening. It was not just something that was taking place here in America, okay? It was taking place in Europe, specifically in Great Britain and in Germany, and in other places across Europe, okay? In Great Britain, they had the Holy Club at Oxford. How would you like to be going to Oxford University, or any university for that matter, and say, are you in any clubs? Yeah, I'm in the Holy Club. Oh. But the Holy Club featured the Wesleys, John and Charles, George Whitefield, that we're going to talk about a little bit more today, was a part of that. John and Charles Wesley, you probably remember as the Methodism guys. They were the ones who developed the disciplines of Methodism. Okay. Then there's this event that took place at the Scottish Cambuslang. I think I said that right. Every time I looked at it in my notes, I just said Cowabunga. No, I'm serious. That was the way I kept it in my mind. That's the way I kept thinking about it. The Cowabunga. Anyway, it was begun by a guy named McCullough, who was just an average, everyday, kind of boring preacher. But he started reading about what was going on with the Wesleys and with George Whitefield. And the more he read, the more he shared, even from the pulpit, stories about what was going on in these other revivals, right? Well, the people got all excited about this. The people got excited about it, and so they started forming prayer groups and ministry groups and all of this stuff. And the next thing you know, they started having these huge meetings where they didn't fit in the church anymore. So they went down to the river, and there was an area that's the Cowabunga area, and they had this kind of like a natural amphitheater, and they started drawing crowds of thousands to that. Well, McCullough got so excited, he writes to George Whitefield and says, listen, you got to come down here and check this out. You got to come. And so George did. He came down there, started preaching, and sure enough, he preached there several times. It was one of his favorite places to preach because the acoustics of the place lent so well to him being able to preach to a large group of people, and there was always a large group of people. But you probably never heard about that revival, But thousands, okay? The Welsh revival of 1735 was one of the first of the Welsh revivals. The Welsh revivals went on into the 1900s. Okay, and the Welsh revivals, incredible things were happening over there. When you come over to Germany, they had come from the Reformation background. And those of you that have been in David's class, you know what that's all about. And as a result, they had developed what was called the German pietism. Okay? But there was one particular group from Moravia. They were immigrants to the area. Now we're having to deal with immigrants now, right? Okay. Well, they were immigrants to the area, and as such, they weren't exactly welcomed as much as they would like, but Christians welcomed them, taught them, discipled them, and the Moravians. Did you ever talk about Hus in your class? Yeah. I can't remember his first name, but thank you. He was one of the big time reformers, okay, and they were big time disciples of Hus. So they came in and they started praying and seeking the Lord. Revival broke out amongst the Moravian people that spread throughout the whole area of Germany. But they did something that was absolutely remarkable. You ready for this? They started a 24/7 prayer ministry. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. A man and a woman were assigned to each hour of the day to pray for an hour. And you say, well, that's no big deal. As a matter of fact, I served in church once where we did exactly the same thing. So that's no big deal. Except theirs went on for 100 years. Yeah! 100 years that prayer meeting continued. Huh? That's revival, people. Anyway, so things were happening, not just here in America, but things were happening around the world. And you can read about things that were going on all across the world, okay? I choose those because of the tie-ins to what we're doing. So, there were 13 original colonies, right? If I asked you to close your eyes and name them, you think you could? You probably could. I bet you could, you know? I had AI draw up this map for me. That's why it's kind of cockeyed. You know, it's kind of leaning over to the side. That's all right. It fit on the page, so that's what counts, right? 6 of those original colonies were founded primarily with a Christian intent. Okay? The other 7 were founded primarily with a financial or political intent, mostly financial. Okay? The thing is, and if you'll go back 2 sessions ago, you remember, or 3 sessions ago, remember we were talking about coming to America? Everybody who came with priests, preachers, missionaries, people that they brought with them. Usually they came, even if they were seeking financial gain, they came under the auspices of the church. It's just that wasn't their principal intent, was to spread the gospel. Their principal intent was to make money. Right? So in all 13 colonies, there was religious work that was going on. There was Christian work that was going on. I told you we're barreling through, right? And in the Great Awakening itself, we can divide it into 3 basic time frames. The first one is the early sparks of revival. We talked about this a little bit last week when we talked about Jonathan Edwards and the revival at Northampton and the booklet that he wrote about revivalism that was sent to John Wesley. It wasn't sent to them, but they read it. George Whitefield read it. Others across the country of England and all across America read it. Okay? Revival was happening. Revival was happening back then. Okay? The next thing is the peak area, the peak time was 39 through 42. That's when George Whitefield was at his strongest. That's when he was really doing his thing. And you'll see the primary areas where he was. You see how we're still up on the north? We're still up in New England, basically. Right? Now, at that time, George Whitefield actually was coming into Georgia. He had already started his orphanage down there. Okay? It wasn't that there was no presence, there was no revivalist presence down there. It's just that that's where he was setting up his orphanage, but where he was preaching mostly was in the urban areas up in the Northeast. So, next, the Southern Wave. The 40s and 50s, it moves down into Virginia, North Carolina, principally those two. It did move on farther south, but this is good news for us. Okay? Now you can't really see it, and it's not circled over there, but do you see Rhode Island? Do you see it pointing to Rhode Island? But you can't even see Rhode Island because I covered it up with a blue circle. It's tiny. That's where the Baptists were. In that tiny little Rhode Island, see, that's about the size of Harris County. That's where the Baptists had to hang out, right? But what happened down here in North Carolina was the Baptists took hold, the Methodists took hold, and the Presbyterians took hold. Oh, and those circuit riding preachers were all over that part of the world. And so really the explosion of Baptists in America really began with Billy Graham in North Carolina. No, Billy Graham did, yeah, he was from North Carolina, but that's neither here nor there. No, but it did begin in North Carolina. Okay? Sorry. Let's go on. I mentioned George Whitefield, right? He did 7 preaching tours in the Americas. Okay, I use the term America. You understand there ain't no America now. Just keep that in mind. If I use the term America, know that I know what I'm talking about. There's no America yet. The colonies, okay? But he did seven tours during that time. He actually crossed the Atlantic 13 different times. And back then, just crossing the Atlantic was a big deal. I mean, it was a huge deal. Just getting from one side of the pond to the other was a big, stinking deal. But he was back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, okay? He preached to hundreds of thousands. As a matter of fact, the population in about 1750 was somewhere around 1 million, somewhere in that neighborhood. And it's estimated that he preached, or that about at least 800,000 at one time or another heard him at least once. Isn't that amazing? Just think about that. We're not talking, yes, sir.
I was just wanting to add to what you're saying there. It was not just him preaching, but he joined with Benjamin Franklin, who would publish his sermons.
Yes.
And so it was not just the oral presentation of the gospel, but it was these sermons that were published and went all over the United States.
Yes, and spread. Did you say and Britain?
Yes.
Yes. And they spread, made Ben some do-re-mi. You understand? But yes, it was being spread in print as well. Okay? He spoke to thousands at a time. As many as 30,000. I've told this story so many times, and it sounds like a brag, and actually, I guess in my mind it is, and I'm going to say it anyway. I'm not even saying it's a humble brag. I used to, Pam and I both, we were involved in the music ministry of First Baptist in Houston, and we did the pageant every year, right? Mm-hmm. And one year, Gerald asked me to do a reading, okay? Kind of an oration of a poem called One Solitary Life. For nothing has affected the life of man on this earth than this one solitary life. Anyway, he asked me to do the oration, and he asked me to do it like that, okay? The only problem was, that's a place that would seat 5,000. We had a full orchestra. I did this reading over the orchestra with a mic. except for the time when the guy who was using my mic, we traded mics on stage, right? The guy who was using my mic was singing a solo, it cut out on him. As we were passing each other and I was walking out to the cross aisle to go do this, he said, "Good luck." I walked out there, I tapped it, checked it. I said one phrase, my first phrase, and I knew, and I said it loud because I didn't think it was going to pick it up, but I could tell, nope, nothing. So I just put it down at my side and I said the whole thing. Right? Gerald said, "That is the first time we've ever had a standing ovation in the middle of an act." By the way, it happened again, and my wife was the one that did the other one when she played Kate Smith. That's another story. Okay, but guys, it is possible for you to project your voice so that thousands can be heard. I mean, if I can do it, right? I mean, it can be done. And Benjamin Franklin didn't think so. Benjamin Franklin said there is no way until he actually heard him. And then he started, as a matter of fact, I started to post the calculations that he made to determine how many people were there, how many people could hear, all this kind of stuff. And he calculated it out mathematically. And that's when he estimated that there were 30,000 people that were hearing George Whitefield at that particular point, and he was standing way back on the backside of the crowd and heard every word. In 1770, he died. He had just preached a 2-hour sermon to a crowd of over 6,000. He left town that night, went to stay with a friend, died before the next morning, age 55. Still going by the numbers, Jonathan Edwards. He preached sinners in the hands of an angry God in Enfield, Connecticut. There were about 400 or 500 in attendance, okay? What's interesting about this is that it was not the huge crowd, and yet this sermon, and it was also printed. I don't think Benjamin Franklin did it. I don't remember who did, but it was also printed just as things work. And that sermon made the rounds after that. He had preached it at his home church in Northampton, and they went, "Oh, that's nice." I'm serious. He preached sinners in the hands of an angry God, and they just kind of thought, "Yeah, okay, that's all right." But then he goes down there and he starts preaching this at a place where he had actually been called in to speak to people about revival and about repentance, about grace. And as the sermon went on, people started wailing, moaning, screaming, pounding their chests, screaming out, "What do I have to be saved?" The noise got to the point several times in the course of the sermon that Edwards had to ask the crowd to be quiet so he could talk. "Would you please keep your voices down so I can finish?" Several times that happened. Yes?
I'd also be interested to note that he used a level voice.
Yes!
And stared at the bell rope at the back of the church.
Yeah.
And so it was just his words and the way that he spoke the message that was...
It was flat, monotone speaking. Yes. Yes. It was the power of God. It was the power of God. So, one more thing when we're talking about the Great Awakening by the numbers. 5 new light colleges. I said 5. There were actually a couple of others. There were 5 that I wanted you to be aware of. Look at the names of those schools. Columbia. You ever heard of Columbia University? How about Brown University? Yeah? Ever heard of Brown? Yeah? Princeton? Rutgers? Dartmouth. You ever hear of those places? They were all what we call New Light colleges. Harvard and Yale were already in existence at this time. They were Old Light colleges. And you say, but Bob, what's the difference between an Old Light and a New Light? I'm glad you asked. As the revivalism was breaking out across the land, it was shaking the very foundations of the traditional church and the traditional clergy. Their positions of authority were being shaken to the roots. Because all of a sudden, people were reading the Bible for themselves. You can't do that. Come on. People were discovering for themselves the beauty of God in a personal relationship. You can't do that. We have to be the ones that tell you how this works. And so they rose up against them. As a matter of fact, is it Chaucer? Help me out. Was Chaucer at Harvard, president of Harvard, or was he Yale? I don't remember.
He was a pastor.
He was a pastor, but then... Okay.
I'm sure that he impacted Harvard because by 1803, Harvard was a unitarian institution.
Right, right. But he was one of the big ones.
Charles Chaucer.
Yeah, Charles. Thank you. He was one of the big ones. And they were standing up against them, and they were telling their parishioners, their congregants, they were telling them, don't listen to these people. They're going to lead you astray. All of this emotionalism, all of this stuff, that has no place in the church. They were the Old Lights. So now you know who the New Lights were. People like George, Wesley's, and all kinds of others that were developing during this time.
Brown was Baptist.
Yes, it was. Thank you. Thank you. Guys, things were happening. Things were happening. And these colleges represent the new lights that sprung up. Okay? These colleges were developed because the preachers that they wanted to develop couldn't get what they needed to do what they needed to do as part of the awakening at these schools. That's why these schools developed. Now, I'm just going to throw this in for free. I want you to notice that even Harvard and Yale, all of those were Christian organizations when they began. Are you with me? Would you call them Christian organizations today? And yet, that was their beginnings. That was their foundings. That was where they came from. That's their heritage. Okay? Yes, sir.
I just got to say it. At Brown University, back about 15, 20 years ago, the son of Nikita Khrushchev was a professor.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Sergei Khrushchev was a nuclear engineer.
Oh, wow.
Nuclear physicist that was there.
Wow.
And you could get him to come to speak. He was on the lecture circuit here in the United States.
Oh, wow.
I don't think he's around.
Can you take off his shoe? I'm just curious. Okay. Okay. We're almost at question and answer time, a question Q&A time. Okay. This is something of a summation, if you will. I'm going to read this. God in his sovereignty awakened the colonialists spiritually, and in so doing broke down traditional religious barriers, challenged the misguided authority of the established clergy. The Great Awakening fostered a unique sense of shared inter-colonial identity and a democratic spirit. It taught ordinary individuals that they had the spiritual authority to make their own religious choices, an egalitarian mindset, that helped pave the way philosophically for the American Revolution. That's what the Great Awakening did. Now I'm going to go ahead and give you the quote of the day. The quote of the day comes from George Whitefield. The day that he preached his last sermon, one of his friends commented on the fact that he didn't look well enough to preach. So are you sure you ought to go out there, George? I don't know about this. I don't think you need to do this. And instead of responding to his friend, he looked up to heaven and he said, Lord, I am weary in thy work, but not weary in doing it. Went out and preached that sermon and was dead within 24 hours later.